Good morning, everyone, and welcome to OETC and Microsoft's M365 webinar series. I'm James Kelly, OETC's Marketing Coordinator. Today's session will cover common attack vectors, pitfalls to avoid, and some differences between Microsoft 365 A3 and A5, as well as some best practices that you can put in place. The session will be presented by Nick Caromano, a Senior Security and Compliance Technical Specialist at Microsoft. The session is also being recorded and will be sent out next week along with the slide deck. There may be time for Q&A at the end, so feel free to ask your questions throughout the webinar. On the next slide, I'll take a quick moment to highlight OETC's renewal team, some of whom are on today's webinar. If you have any licensing questions, you can reach out to help@oetc.org, and someone from the team will be happy to assist you. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Nick.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Happy to be here. Let me change it over to my little intro slide. So as James mentioned, I am Nick Caromano. I am a Senior Technical Specialist for Security and Compliance here at Microsoft US Education. Basically, it's a fancy way of saying I get the honor and the pleasure of speaking to customers like yourselves all across our education vertical nationwide about all of the Microsoft 365 security and compliance products. So it's a lot. It's a lot of fun, and it's a lot of great conversations. If you wish to connect outside of this, please feel free to follow me on Twitter. Sometimes I say really cool things, sometimes I don't. Also, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. And if there are any additional questions, I'm happy to reach to help as I can from an architectural perspective. And my email address is there at the very bottom. So as you heard, the overall agenda today is we're going to talk a little bit about the landscape. So what's going on in the industry today? What are the kind of the big things that we kind of need to be worried about? And I'm sure all of you are very much aware of them, and just show the metrics that are behind that, as well as some of the common attack vectors that really relate around what we're seeing in the landscape. They pretty much go hand in hand. We'll talk about some common misbeliefs or false beliefs and some pitfalls that a lot of the times customers tend to fall into. It's by no means perfect. A lot of times there's a necessity for why you're doing that or why you think that. And please don't take this as we're saying you're wrong. Everybody's got their own reasons for things. I also mentioned we'll talk a little bit about the Microsoft 365 A3, A5. Now, I'm not a licensing person by any means. I'm a technical resource, which is good because licensing is never fun. That's why we have our awesome friends at OETC to kind of help with that. So we'll touch a little bit on that. We'll talk about some quick wins, so things that you can take from this presentation and go to your environment and potentially implement should you feel comfortable enough to do so, and you kind of understand the impact there and the overall strategy behind it. But then more importantly, I'm going to leave you in this deck that you'll get next week, some homework, if you will, some things that you can read through that will help you build that foundational strategy around your security and compliance and even backups from that perspective within your environment. Again, we'll hopefully have some time at the end for Q&A. I'll talk as quick as I can without being super fast, but please do feel free to ask questions throughout. I do ask that you stay muted throughout the presentation unless you have a question, just so we can make sure we don't have any background noise kind of creeping in. But if you do have a question, throw a virtual football at me or just keep yelling at me until I stop talking. Otherwise, I'll just keep going and going like the Energizer Bunny. So with that, let's discuss what things look like overall. So what's happening out there? What is Microsoft seeing? And what are some of our partners even seeing from a reporting perspective? It's important to understand, though, before we get into that piece, is how is Microsoft kind of pulling all this together? So for one, we release a once-a-year report that goes through all of our digital forensics findings across all of our customers, even in both commercial, which education is included, as well as our consumer customers. So think Outlook.com, Xbox, and so forth. And what this means is that we pull in an obscene amount of data. Now, of course, this is not us spying. There's nothing like that. This is telemetry that helps Microsoft understand how the services are being leveraged, and then, of course, where those compromises potentially take place across our product portfolio, both again on the commercial and on the consumer side. So you can see, for example, here we analyze over 470 billion emails that come through all of our Office 365 and Outlook.com services. That's a huge amount of telemetry that a lot of people don't see on any given 5-year, 10-year span within their own environment. So all of these signals are used to start building out what we call our digital forensics report. And again, these reports start to show kind of what's happening across the landscape when it comes to protecting and mitigating risk within our environments. COVID has been interesting, right? It's been sad. It's been a lot, and I don't want to talk too much about that because it's already got more attention than it really deserves overall, right? We want to move past this. But what it has shown us is that cyber criminals follow trends, and malware is one of those things that we saw really hit heavy when it came to anything that was COVID related, whether it was when the vaccines were starting to be released, when the first pandemic kind of hit, and of course education was hit very heavily, as we all know. And we can see here, just based on this trend, where when things were happening in the world, as far as health and the pandemic and what was going on, you can see that there's an uptick in the theming of malware and other forms of attacks that were kind of spearheading off of the coattails, if you will. And what this really allowed to happen is people started to reduce their human firewall, their defenses to a degree, because they were so used and kind of numb to seeing things related to COVID. But even before COVID, there's always been that kind of mentality where once we see something a lot, we typically get used to it. And so that leads to a lot of phishing, whether it's spear phishing or business email compromise or credential phishing, you name it. You can see here that of the top 10 targeted industries, education's on that list. And it's not too far down the list either. And so we all understand and know that, yes, COVID was a big, projector, if you will, of that, or kind of a catapult for the whole scenario. But phishing and spear phishing and anything from an email perspective has always been a big issue within the education industry. And even going beyond that are the nation state threats. So things that are specifically targeted at organizations, whether it be education or a commercial entity such as Coca-Cola, or you name a big product name and that's out there. And really kind of working with our end users to help them understand and see almost how to identify these threats beyond just leveraging technology and platforms to help mitigate the risk before it even happens. So things like reconnaissance and how they're trying to manipulate the way names look within email addresses, or of course the credential harvesting, where again we're using characters in a creative way to kind of blend and make it to where if you're not really paying attention, you might accidentally click on that link within that email. And ransomware, our favorite topic, right? Everybody loves ransomware. No, we don't. Ransomware has been a huge endeavor and a huge market pain, for lack of a better terms, and what we're seeing not only in education, but basically any vertical in any industry. And it's a huge impact, right? Not only from an inconvenience perspective, to put it simply, but also because of the whole espionage and the requirement of payment and what we're seeing as far as actual true ransom of holding that data hostage from these organizations that truly need it. Hospitals obviously being a big one. And so Microsoft and our Microsoft Dart team, which is our detection and response team, have seen a huge uptick in ransomware and the rise of ransomware across all verticals. And more importantly, a huge rise in human-operated ransomware, which essentially means hands-on keyboard. So no longer is it just I send an email and I hope some organization person opens it in HR and I get access. Now they're truly pinpointing and looking at specific organizations, including in education, on how they want to attack and purposefully curating it to look as authentic as possible to get in through that front door. And that front door could be things like email or just general identity. To continue to prove upon that, what we're seeing in education, this pie chart is kind of scary. And it's also eye-opening. It goes to show that education is the leader in the malware industry, if you will. They are the ones that are targeted the most when it comes to either just the hope for the best type of malware, where again, I send it out to a bunch of email addresses I pulled from a list. I hope someone clicks on it and I get a win, all the way down to the human operated and targeted type of malware and ransomware. So these are some of the top malware threats in education today that you'll see. These are awesome names. If you don't quite understand them, the deck has them so you can click on, kind of read about them and what they do. But also at the very bottom left corner here is our Windows Defender threats report that we publicly disclose. I think it's every quarter or once a month, but the data gets updated so you can kind of see what this overall impact looks like specific to malware and ransomware within any industry. And it's not just Microsoft that's seeing this, right? So here's a great third party that Microsoft also likes to talk with and partner with as far as what we're seeing in industry, including education. And so this one is done by the Verizon DBIR report from 2021. And you can see the frequency is going up. We can see the top patterns, a lot of them being and revolving around social engineering. So a lot of the spear phishing capabilities. And then we're seeing a lot of the actor motives, again, being primarily financial. Right, so that's another reason why ransomware continues to grow is the ability for them to quickly recoup costs from an attacker perspective. And then we're seeing the types of data compromise leading with personal identifiable information, so social security numbers, anything related to student IDs, which is very close and important to us. And it's very important that we protect as much of the student information, more important than anything else. And then beyond just the standard ransomware and email attacks, Microsoft is seeing a lot from the identity perspective as well. So identity-based attacks grew quite significantly during the first half of the pandemic. A lot of that because we were moving to, and very quickly moving to, a remote learning, a remote work, or a hybrid learning, hybrid work mentality and kind of strategy. And a lot of the times we found that our customers, especially smaller customers, were not necessarily equipped to handle the type of modern identity platform that they kind of need in order to not only give users access to what they need to do their day-to-day jobs, but also to better protect them and alert IT of anything that's kind of nefarious looking or anomalous. And then, of course, we saw a huge uptick in the enablement of multi-factor authentication, which we'll talk a little bit more here in a little bit as well. But that's awesome. And you can see that overall, that helps to significantly reduce and mitigate the identity risk that we have, whether they're remote or on-prem. Really doesn't matter at that point, which is great. So kind of going from the landscape, these are some of those common misbeliefs / pitfalls, right? Attackers just aren't interested in us. We're education, or we're a K-12 or a K-3 or a daycare, whatever the case might be. And that's so not true. Especially today with ransomware, again, being the big name out in the field right now. I apologize for saying it. If you're playing a bingo game, you can really count that ransomware word. But just seeing the huge uptick in that, and education being one of them, unfortunately, that's picked on the most because they understand the complexities and sometimes the shortcomings that we have in the education market, where we may not have a full security staff. We may not have a full compliance team. We may not have all the bells and whistles that we need in order to better protect our students and our staff and faculty, and they're kind of banking on that, literally. Firewalls. A lot of people still believe that my perimeter-based network protections are all I need. As long as my devices are on-prem and in my campuses, I'm good. And to a point, that's still very much necessary. I'm not saying to go rip out firewalls, but today's mentality is moving to that perimeter-less kind of movement, right? Obviously, with remote learning and remote work, that's become even more truer. And so we need to start looking at ways to better understand and protect our users and devices as well as our data, no matter where they're located, whether they're on a campus or not. And passwords. So a lot of organizations still rely on, I've got a super complex password policy and I require 90-day changes. That's no longer useful anymore. What we found is your complex requirements can be easily just, fall 2021 ! Boom, I've done it. And then next year I'll do the same thing, fall 2022. And rotating passwords actually can harm our security foundation because users start to become a little bit more complacent and lazy, and they start reiterating their passwords because they don't want to remember something else. They might have started with a very complex and good password, but because we force them to change it later, they're using that easy kind of rhythmic change to kind of remember that. MFA, though, still significantly helps, even with a bad password. A bad password with MFA is still super important compared to just a bad password. VPNs, a lot of times we think VPNs are the one-all be-all for the remote learning capability as far as protecting data access and overall the security between the device and our on-premise appliances. And to some point, that is very true. But it's also one that tends to get ignored when it comes to updates, like we're talking about here in that next column there. It also tends to get ignored as far as threat and vulnerability management. Are there any CVEs currently open for VPN? And then how are we authenticating VPN? Are we still relying on password and username? Maybe we're using a client certificate, which is better, but we really should also be obviously moving all that authentication to a centralized modern identity platform. Updates, obviously, like I mentioned, for VPN appliances, but overall, a lot of the times we see Windows clients and Mac OS clients and even mobile devices that are still kept out of date for X, Y, and Z reason. Some of this is because of lack of resources from a people perspective, and other times it's just I didn't feel like pushing updates and upsetting my users. But it's absolutely critical that we keep all of our platforms up to date. And really, it's wasting time. We have sometimes a lot of really cool solutions that we just turn on and use the defaults, and in some cases that might work. Other times it becomes very noisy, and so we have to work on triaging millions or thousands of alerts, and it becomes tiresome, and we're losing focus on what's most important because we're dealing with some informational-like alerts that really could have been ignored because it's really nothing to worry about at the moment, but could be later down the road, right? And so all of that comes together to kind of show that it's challenging to secure an environment, right? The threat landscape continues to evolve. As we saw from the metrics before, today's flavor of malware and ransomware might be a completely different flavor come next year. There might be something new that attackers are leveraging to their advantage. But correlation of signals is time consuming, and it can be extremely expensive if we're doing it manually, especially, but even some other types of solutions where they're trying to help with that really kind of don't work within the environment, or they're having large gaps between certain workloads. And disparate solutions are what help to cause those gaps, right? They don't have the same integrations with capabilities to truly understand what each one of them are doing, and they don't understand what other workloads are doing beyond what they were physically or scoped to and built for. And that's where we start to get into Microsoft 365. And what does it mean to leverage a true cross-domain XDR-like solution that is able to help bridge and remove virtually all of those gaps between your workloads and give you that holistic view so that you have a better understanding of what's happening within your environment. Now, it can't be a presentation without a little bit of licensing, right? One of my favorite resources, and again, I'm not a licensing person, but one of my favorite resources are licensing on a page that is done by a solution specialist out of Australia. These are not official, but they do have links, and I have links as well as in this deck that take you to the official documentation for licensing, as always, and verify with your amazing friend within OETC. But what these essentially do is they help to break up what's in each of the SKUs. And so each of these little squares that are on these pages, again, the links are in the deck, give you an idea of what features and capabilities are in there. So for example, here's A3, which comes with a lot already, right? Before we even start talking about A5, and a lot of this has to do with better protecting our users, our data, and our devices. And so it's a good amount of things to get started on your journey, whether it's security focused or compliance focused or both. But then A5 adds on top of that. And really A5 brings to the table not as many squares if you're looking at the diagram, but a lot in functionality and capability as we start talking about things like automation, advanced heuristics, that cross-domain capability, and then even things like insider risk and advanced DLP capabilities. Sometimes we focus too much on the external threats that we tend to forget that sometimes we do have internal threats as well, whether it's intently or inadvertently. And there's much, much more to that as well. The other thing to note about A5 is it doesn't have to be the Cadillac SKU that you go through. It's a journey, right? So sometimes you might want to focus on things like the security components. So you can do the A5 security, which is almost like a mini bundle. If you're familiar with Progressive, we've got bundles too. Or you can do A5 compliance, which is a bundle of all the compliance capabilities. And so it's at a reduced cost versus the full A5 and gives you a little bit more flexibility in how you kind of leverage that from a licensing perspective. So definitely speak with OETC about that as well. But once you get past the licensing components, you start to see that these bring together a unique solution. It's built in experiences that go across our platform. So whether you're using Word on the desktop or Word online or Outlook in the web or Outlook on your desktop, we want to make sure that specific capabilities from a security and compliance perspective look and work the same from an end user experience. The ultimate goal here is to make sure that the user's experience is as seamless as possible while we're still doing our due diligence to protect and mitigate. Obviously, leveraging AI and automation. So this is going back to education has sometimes a lack of people resources on their teams. How can we supplement some of the mundane, everyday tasks that we might have somebody looking at, especially like a security analyst? How do we give them more play in their day to focus on big ticket items while we allow the services to work on our behalf to handle things like a ransomware outbreak or your standard typical malware that all it does is adware or anything like that? And then, of course, from that perspective is having a truly integrated solution that spans across the people, the devices, the apps, and the data. It's no longer something where we can focus on one specific thing. We need to span across all of those workloads. And you'll see that Microsoft's security and compliance solutions do exactly that. Even though we silo them out to a degree as far as from a marketing and a discussion perspective, each one of these columns or workloads or verticals, whatever you want to call it, all come together at the end of the day to truly build upon that virtually gapless experience that we need from a security and compliance perspective. And we can see that by going and understanding the individual products and then how they start to come together. So a lot of this is around the A5 components, and we'll talk a little bit about what's still in A3 that you can take advantage of today as well. But it's important to understand that long-term strategies should include things like this. So you'll see here identities, endpoints, cloud apps, user data. Those are the columns, again, the verticals or the workloads that Microsoft focuses on, but focuses on them together. We want to make sure that we shift away from the mindset of having these individual silos and move more towards that coordinated cross-domain security platform. And so what happens in the Microsoft world is all of these get connected. They still work individually and they do what they do best in their individual workload, but then they share that telemetry with each other. They share what's happening with each other so that if one detects something that the other one missed, they learn from each other. So not only do we have cloud scale artificial intelligence, but now we have the ability for them to truly build upon their own learnings within their own workloads before anything from Microsoft or third parties or even yourselves come into play from a custom detection perspective. And of course, we want to take all this and make it easy on you as the administrators. So not only do we want to make the services work better together and help to remove those virtual gaps, but we also want to make it easy for you from the perspective of where do I go to manage and support these? So starting with one portal, we are doing a lot in this realm to where we are trying to bring all of these services together into a centralized security portal. So you've got one single pane of glass, and we're very much ahead of our schedule on making that a true thing with about 3.5 or 2.5 of our services already being in a centralized portal today, which is fantastic. But then coordinated active protection from threats, meaning how do we make sure that if Defender for Endpoint detects something, it also works with Defender for Identity to start its investigations before you even get an alert that something happened, because it's already starting to do the investigation and remediate the issue for you. When remediation being a big aspect of that from an automatic healing perspective. The hope here is that at the end of the day, you get an alert that says, hey, here's exactly what happened. Here are the impacted entities. Here's what I've done to automatically solve this for you. You have nothing that you have to worry about or do now. Just be aware that it happened. And then that unified threat intelligence and analytics. So not only within the Microsoft stack, but within third parties. How are we working with security vendors across the industry to better protect all of our customers, whether they're using our solutions or not? And then cross-domain threat hunting, making it as easy as possible for you to do query-based threat hunting across all the workloads within Microsoft 365 and even third-party solutions as well. And all of this comes together, again, in that unified management, unified API connector capability, so you have the ability to pull that data out and put it anywhere else as well, should you need to or as you see fit. All of that goes to say that this brings an end-to-end security and integration perspective of over 40 different security categories that all come together. And the nice thing here is a majority of these are also included in A3 that either get enhanced in A5 or are a functionality that's only in A5, which is pretty fantastic when you think about it, ranging from the unified endpoint management side, from data protection, and then even cloud security, where we're able to then expand beyond Office 365 walls and actually help to protect third parties. Make sure I'm tracking time here as well.
Hey, Nick, we actually just received a question, if you don't mind just answering it really quick. The question is, does one portal mean combining A5 alerts, like Defender, Dashboard, Compliance Alert, Dashboard, and Cloud App Security Dashboard?
Yeah, so today, it's a great question. So yes, today the security portal for security.microsoft.com already pulls in all of the alerts and intelligence information and feed from Defender for Endpoint. And from Defender for Office 365, so the advanced email hygiene components. So those are unified today. It's also already starting to pull in telemetry and information from Defender for Identity, and soon we'll be pulling in information directly from Microsoft Cloud App Security. The next phase from there will be the actual management aspect. So today you can manage in full Defender for Endpoint, Defender for Office 365 in this portal. But the administrative stuff for Microsoft Cloud App Security and Defender for Identity are still siloed, if you will, at the moment. Those will soon be integrated into that centralized portal as well. All right. If that didn't answer, just let me know for sure. Thank you for calling that out. So I'm going to go through a little quick on this, but this is essentially an attack kill chain. And so what this does is helps to give you a visualization of how all these products come together and how they span across the different verticals, right? From applications to endpoints to identity and to the data piece. And we'll talk more about this here in just a second. But what's kind of nice are these quick samples. And again, I'm going to go through this quick, so I really want to try and get to the demo, and I don't want to run out of time. But here, as an example, we have a potentially compromised user that was done either via password spray or successful brute force, Kerberos ticket, whatever the case might be. And because of that, Microsoft 365 Defender and Azure AD work together to automatically detect that there's been a risky user or a compromised user. And that could have been from a leak credential or anything like I just mentioned here, impossible travel, password spray. But the point being is Azure AD then helps to automatically block their sign-ins to any Azure AD applications, including Office 365. And then soon to be, we'll have the ability to automatically also disable their account on-prem to help keep and mitigate the risk of the user spreading and laterally moving around in your on-premise environment as well. So here's another example of phishing email that's coming through. So we're going to block and quarantine the attachment, but then we're also going to go ahead and search all the other mailboxes in the environment to ensure that that attachment maybe didn't get through earlier, or it was masquerading as something else that's slightly different. So we can use all the metadata from that email and that original attachment. So think MD5, SHA-256, and search across, and then automatically start removing that attachment from the mailboxes that are already that have already received that attachment, which is pretty awesome. So think post-breach intervention, if you will. And then, of course, we can then remediate across other solutions like OneDrive, SharePoint, and Teams to look for that same attachment, such as a document, and automatically revoke it and keep the users from doing anything with it. We then share that same data across our graph that also goes to third-party partners, as well as to other solutions like Defender for Endpoint, which will look for that attachment. If it sees it saved locally on a device, we'll go ahead and quarantine the file because we know it's bad. And here's kind of that same endpoint scenario in a little bit more of an advanced perspective. So a user plugs in a USB drive or opens an attachment from a personal email that has a malicious payload, meaning the document's bad. So if we actually, Defender for Endpoint will go ahead and kick in and start doing its thing. But in the meantime, what will happen is, because Defender for Endpoint detected the threat, it'll actually reach out to Azure Active Directory and all the integrated applications and start to restrict access to those applications for any of those devices that have been shown to be impacted by this malicious payload. So then it'll go back and report that, hey, I've gone ahead and cleaned all my devices, and because of that, it's going to automatically then re-grant access to all the applications that were integrated with Azure Active Directory. And so then when we come back to the original solution, everything's been taken care of, there's nothing more for us to do, and all the mailboxes, again, would be cleaned up. The next scenario here, really quick, is the ability for us to change a user's experience based on where they're coming from. So if they're on an unmanaged computer, potentially risky, and they're going to a business critical application, we're going to say they can't do anything like download the file or copy. But if they come from a managed device, we're going to say, hey, your experience is just as you would expect it. And I'll actually show that one here at the demo as well. So now the meat of the presentation, where do you begin? Well, first, it's understand that attackers are like water, right? You plug one hole, there's another hole somewhere else. Water always finds the path of least resistance, and attackers are no different than that. And so really, it's just working on how do we make a bigger impact and a return on our investment from our perspective, as well as making their investment much more expensive, and actually implementing a whole defense in-depth strategy. So ranging from strong authentication, going to identity and threat protection, and of course, information protection. And I kind of alluded to it just a second ago, but the idea behind those three bubbles is this. Our goal is to disrupt the attackers, not necessarily just from protecting and preventing the actual infection or breach or whatever the case might be, but also to make it more costly for the attackers. The more expensive it is for them to attack you, the more likely they're going to go and focus on somebody else who isn't at that same level as you, right? So here are 5 quick wins that you can take from this presentation and potentially do within your environment, again, should you wish to, and after you do your research. What I've done is I've made sure I called out what is available in A3 and then what can be elevated or enhanced in A5 or what might only be an A5 feature or functionality. The first one here is the secure score. This is available in A3 as well as in A5 and enhanced in A5. And this is a great way for you to get just a quick visibility and overview of how are you doing within your environment from a policy perspective, using the features and functionalities that you're paying for, and then also create almost a task list for you to take advantage of. It gives you a breakdown of your points so you can see your metrics and how you stand against yourself. And then you can continue to build upon that by using the actual prioritized improvement actions. And what it will do is give you an insight into what's the impact on your users if you don't do it, and what is the possible impact. Again, we can't think of everything, but the possible impact of then actually implementing this mitigation. From there, you can then actually start to see what the description is, again, at a glance, what the user impact is, the implementation steps, and then for you all as a compliancy requirement, you can then actually create and track your action plan here. So is it completed? Is it planned to do something? Are you accepting the risk? And then any comments and notes and who you've assigned this to, which is great. So if you ever do get audited, you can actually publish these as an auditable report. And of course, it gives you trends. You can see how you're doing against yourself from the past, how you're doing against other tenants similar to you across the nation, and then how are you doing globally across all Office 365 tenants. Again, nothing is proprietary that's shown, that's your data or anything like that. It's simply just here's your credit score, if you will, against others. And then here's a deeper view into that where you can see, again, your overall regression trend. If new improvements are added or new features and functionality added and you haven't capitalized on those, you'll see your score go down and it'll give you an insights into why that happened and where. The next big thing here is strong authentication. So multi-factor, MFA, wherever possible. As you can see here, 99.9% of identity-based attacks can be mitigated with just by having multi-factor authentication enabled. It does not have to be a blanket turn on MFA for everything, for everyone, for all the time, because there is such a thing as MFA fatigue. You get tired of it, you ignore it, you just hit approve all the time. So we're going to talk about conditional access, not specifically about MFA, but conditional access is a way to where you can leverage your telemetry and signals that are coming into Azure AD in order to leverage MFA in a smart, intelligent way. For example, if they're at real-time risk, aka the user has been compromised potentially, or they're coming from an impossible travel-like scenario, or the device is infected or not a managed device, we can see we can change their experience and we can require MFA or just give them access. We can even do this based on locations, and we will talk about countries in a little bit as well. Your first step there from a quick win, administrators. Your admins should absolutely have MFA turned on for everything all the time because they are a high target, they're a high business impact user, and it's something that you should absolutely make sure that they are protected at the very least. And then you start to move into pilot rings with additional users that start to scale down from there. So user data ransomware protection. This is something that's actually built into A3, right? And can, again, builds upon within A5. OneDrive for Business has built-in ransomware protection and restoration capabilities available in A3 today. All you have to do is simply make sure that you are leveraging SharePoint Online for your shared communal-like scenarios, so instead of file shares, and then for user-centric data such as work-in-progress data on their endpoints, make sure it's housed within their OneDrive for Business account. Every A3 user gets a terabyte of OneDrive space, which is a lot, and a lot of times you can even expand that beyond that without any additional cost as well. And the ransomware protection and mitigation here is a huge component of that. Think if the device gets infected, you close the lid, you re-image it in their OneDrive, you hit the restore button. The user can do that on their own if they wish. They sign into their next device, they sign into OneDrive, data comes down, they're right back in business. Long-term plan is to leverage a secure backup, which is in the strategies that are listed later in the presentation here. So you'll see kind of what that means from a perspective of true offsite and secured silo backups beyond using services that rely on automated detection capabilities like OneDrive. So something where catastrophically everything gets locked somehow, in some way, you have the ability to securely restore that, and there's no interconnections or integrations between your secure offsite and your actual live data. It's a long-term plan. Next up is data classification and protection. So this is where we need to try and understand what type of data is in our environment, first and foremost, and then what to do with that data. So we talk a lot about in the compliance world within education, FERPA. FERPA always comes up. How do I protect student data? And even in broader landscape terms, social security numbers, PII, general addresses, things like that, we start to see more and more leaks take place across different verticals all the time. And so from a quick perspective, Office 365 gives you some great capabilities, including in A3, to just classify and understand the data that's in your environment. So you can start to see, are there social security numbers hanging around in OneDrive? Are there social security numbers in SharePoint or within people's emails? And then from there, you can start to plan out what does that look like to actually protect, whether it's leveraging DLP and our 40 plus different types of policies, and I think it's up to 90 now, that you can use as a template to get started, and then moving into actual information protection where we're labeling data manually or automatically being in A5, and adding actual encryption to the file itself so that no matter where that file goes, even if it leaves your possession digitally, that file is digitally shredded if it's not accessed by somebody who can actually authenticate with a user account or on a specific compliant device. And then lateral movement detection. So this is an A5 only feature. Now you can do this either via the mini bundle, and to a degree you can do it semi-standalone, but again, work with OETC and your licensing partner there to kind of understand what that looks like. But this is something that's super easy to do. Just get these squares out here. And it brings a lot of value very quickly. Defender for Identity is the solution that's leveraged behind this, and that's what helps to detect these lateral movement type of scenarios. So it does things like network traffic analytics, security events from your on-premise Active Directory. We do a lot from a user behavior analytics, which is super important as it creates a baseline for 30 days of what is a typical user's day-to-day within your on-premise environment specifically. And then this also integrates with Azure Active Directory. So not only is it helping you to understand your on-premise movement of users, but also your cloud movement of users. But where this comes into play and why it's one of those quick wins is the sensor, as you can see here, is just listed as MDI sensor. You deploy it to your domain controllers. It's secure in the sense of it's an outbound only connection, so it only can talk to the MDI service in the cloud. There's no firewall ports that you have to open up, so we're not opening up ports to a specific agent that's running on our domain controllers, which in and of itself would be a attack surface vector. It's simply outbound only. It does all of its querying locally and sends all the telemetry to the cloud service so that it can do its actual analytics and real-time alerts for you. And there's a lot of detection mechanisms behind this that I don't have listed on the slide, but definitely read through the Deploy Quick Start guide. It'll walk through all the various things that it can do for you that also help for you to understand what happened and what led to possibly a ransomware attack. It'll show you where users were going, if they were doing enumerations across domain admin groups, or if they were doing SMB enumeration, or even network enumeration, and much, much more to help you understand and see where the identity attack came from. A quick bonus one is mitigate passwords. So this is technically number 6, but I'm calling it a bonus. This is available in A3 and can be enhanced in A5. In A3, you have the ability automatically by just leveraging Azure AD, you're using Microsoft's built-in banned password list. So anytime someone goes to change their password, if you're leveraging our self-service password reset capabilities, we will keep them from using the most commonly bad passwords. So this is something that Microsoft does. It's not based on any true data source or list. It's something that we use heuristics and machine learning to kind of help understand. But we do take into account to a degree, what we're seeing from an overall like bad password list that's released every year to help mitigate password sprays and brute force like attacks against Azure Active Directory. The thing that most customers don't know is there's an on-premise component that you can enable, but you have to go through and enable and then actually implement the sensor in order to take advantage of that. So that if you don't use Azure AD as a source of authority for the passwords, you can use a lot of the same functionality and capabilities to protect against bad passwords on-premise as well. Again, with another lightweight sensor that you would deploy. So this is another great bonus quick win.
Nick, I have a quick question that just came in. So it's regarding A5 deployment. So it looks like they are fairly new with the deployment, and as such, they're using a lot of default configurations. So they daily get, quote unquote, users targeted by phish campaigns. So they want to know if we can look at the alert and see if it shows a list of users and a value, and how do they interpret this, and where does this data come from in these insights?
So I can see if I can show something in a demo tenant that can help you as far as just understanding where the data is. But essentially, so phishing campaigns are looking at email clusters. And the email cluster is any form of data that looks and acts similar across multiple email chains. So the subject line might be different, the message body might be different, but the attachment might be the same or have the same adverse effect, aka it's a malicious payload. So when we talk about users are targeted by phishing campaigns, Defender for Office 365, an example, will automatically create a cluster campaign for you so that you can see this campaign has taken place and the sender, as well as, yes, it'll provide a recipient list. Usually all the recipients are split out because you can take different actions depending on the user and what your recommendations would be within your own environment. But all of that would be done through the Threat Explorer within Defender for Office 365. That's also where your actions would be for 0-hour auto purge, which is the post-breach capability we have in order to reach into a mailbox and pull an attachment. All of that would be done through that same portal. I don't think it's listed in my homework list, but if you go to aka.ms/MDO Ninja, and I'll make sure it's in the chat here in a little bit, MDO Ninja, it's a full training solution that was done by the product group that will actually have sections on how to investigate and go through the actual threat hunting detection scenarios within your tenant. So you can walk, there's videos, there's step-by-step guides, and then there's even to a degree some simulated scenarios that you can go through that the product group has put together that's all free. So it's another thing that I would also highly recommend. Beyond that, obviously, if you want Microsoft to help walk through that, that would be an engagement through something like Microsoft Support, where they could potentially come in and try to help you from an investigation perspective, or of course, any of our amazing partners.
Great.
All right, so next up is kind of leading into the best practices. So how to build out your framework. So there's a lot of slides here that actually these zoom into, so I don't want to go through them because it'll take up pretty much the entire rest of this presentation. But for all of your homework, when you get this deck, highly recommend that you go through this. So this is actually from our human-operated ransomware mitigation plan that Microsoft has publicly disclosed. And that in and of itself is a great presentation. You should definitely take a look at that. It's linked in the Learning More stuff as well. But the ones that have a star actually correlate to those quick wins. So you can see that you can start to make an impact on these longer-term strategy plans very, very quickly before you even start diving into them. To give you a quick insight into kind of what this looks like, excuse me. So if you click on any of these, so collaboration, since that was something that just came up, it'll give you the what, the why, the how, the who, and then your measures of success, and then who your stakeholders should be. So it's meant to be simplistic in the sense of it's there to kickstart things. Obviously, this can go significantly deeper, but you can leverage this as a means to create that foundation, that jumping off point, and check these boxes and leverage the short links that go out to where you could read a bit more or see specific step-by-step guides. So very, very useful from that perspective of where do I start from a more depth perspective versus just the quick wins that we quickly went through. So again, we're not going to go through all of these. Just be sure that when you get a copy of this deck, that you go through these. They're very, very helpful. And you'll see here the secure backups, which we'll talk a lot about what I was mentioning before about having that siloed, truly independent backup solution to help from a ransomware mitigation perspective. So now we get to see some things live. Hopefully the demo gods are with me today. So we're going to quickly walk through conditional access. I'm going to show you really quick, what does it look like to create a conditional access policy for blocking legacy access, and I'll explain why that's important, as well as how to basically create a banned country sign-in list that you can very quickly leverage to cut down on a lot of impossible travel or password spray / brute force like attacks in Azure Active Directory. We'll talk a little bit about DLP, specifically around credit card data, and then student IDs being a big topic. Information protection, I'll show you kind of a sensitivity label and how it acts as encryption and how it helps to protect the data should it leave your environment. And then we'll talk a little bit about an A5 specific feature around session controls for OneDrive for Business, so our first-party solution, as well as for third-party like Google Workspace. So with that, let's flip over. All right. So first things first is conditional access. And I will zoom in so we can make sure everybody can see. So my screen's probably tiny. Okay, so I'm logged in as an administrator in my Contoso EDU tenant, and I'm looking within Azure Active Directory, and I'm specifically in the security module for conditional access policies. Now, I've already created quite a few. I also have my own naming convention, so I'm using prod or dev, so I very quickly know, if something is actually in production being leveraged or if I'm just testing things. Naming convention is entirely up to you, but I highly recommend you have a good one. So the first one is going to be around the legacy auth. So to create the policy is very simple, and I'll show you how to create it, and I'll explain to you why it's important that you do. So first, conditional access policies overall, if you haven't leveraged them before, work as a if-then statement to a degree. So essentially what we're doing is we're telling it, if the person that's signing into X, Y, and Z service or application is one of the users I've selected, we're going to continue down the path and look at additional conditions and then make a decision on something. So you can always do an include and an exclude. In this case, I'm selecting all users, and we'll talk about best practices for this specific one here in just a second as well. The next piece is you select the application this policy is going to affect. Again, in this case, I'm selecting all of them, but in other cases, you might want to select specific applications or specific services based on what you're trying to achieve, such as, for example, maybe we only select the administrator roles, which we can do under the users and groups, because we don't want to impact everybody else in our environment, say for MFA. And then for applications, maybe we're not going to require MFA on their OneDrive for Business, but we will for everything other than that, right? Or any third-party applications we've integrated, maybe if it's only high business impact solutions that we're going to require MFA. And the list kind of goes on from there. In this case, again, we're selecting all cloud apps. From a conditions perspective, we're ignoring pretty much everything else except for client apps, where we're choosing specifically legacy authentication clients. So that's going to be Exchange, ActiveSync, and all other. We'll talk about the all other. And then for our counterintuitive naming, our grant is going to be a block. So we're going to actually block their ability to then sign in. So now, why is this important? What is this whole legacy authentication thing? I talked about multi-factor authentication being very important. 99.9% of identity-based attacks can be mitigated, right? That was the metric that's been mentioned by Microsoft, other third-party industry leaders, and I'm leveraging that same marketing term here. But there's a caveat to that. There are legacy authentication protocols. Think POP for email, IMAP for email, ActiveSync falls under that. Older versions of ActiveSync fall under that as well, and a few other ones like SMTP that don't understand the modern authentication flow. So they ignore multi-factor authentication, aka they simply just ask for a username and password, and then they let you in, right? Now, sometimes there's been updates to those clients where they're able to accept an MFA password, which is an older way of kind of helping bridge that gap, but it's still not as secure as truly doing inline web-based authentication and understanding what an MFA token is. So a lot of times when we see people who have, I've deployed MFA, but my email was still compromised, it's usually because legacy authentication was still allowed. Now, you can disable it on the tenant side and completely block it for everybody, which is a great thing to do long-term. But what this allows you to do is do that in steps, because once you block legacy authentication, you'll start to see mail clients that people might truly love and use on a day-to-day basis will stop functioning. So, for example, the Thunderbird mail client, which is very popular on Linux distros, would stop to function. Certain versions of the native Android mail client, because Android is fragmented, there's different vendors that can have different types of applications, those might break. So by putting this either in a report-only mode and affecting everybody, you can see very quickly who's actually still leveraging these authentication methods so that you can work with them hand in hand to understand what are they trying to do, what are they doing, what apps are they trying to use, and then you can slowly work with them in a white glove approach to migrate them. And then once you're ready, you can turn it on or do a phased rollout so that certain groups of people automatically get this blocked to better protect their user identities within the cloud. That's kind of the quick on that one. So the next conditional policy is going to be blocking countries. So you start off by actually creating a named location group. And so what I've done here is I've created a group called blocked countries. And when you create a country location, you could choose to select everything. So I've selected basically everything, including unknown countries and regions. So that will help to a degree with things like the Tor browser and so forth. And then I've unselected the United States. The US is the only one that's allowed that's not in this blocked location list. And so when you create conditional access policies, what I like to do is create just a separate conditional access policy for just this purpose, which I've done up here. And essentially, just like the legacy authentication policy, I'm selecting all users with an exclusion of my emergency break glass account, which we have best practices on that. So if you haven't implemented that yourself, highly recommend you look up Office 365 break glass account. It's very important to have. That's the only user that's been excluded. I'm then selecting any application that's integrated with Azure AD. And then my condition, I'm looking at location. And I'm saying if they are coming from anything that's in my blocked country's location, I'm then going to block access, aka meaning that if they're in the United States and they're signing in, you're good. And then it'll look for other conditional access policies to evaluate against that. But if they're coming from Russia or if they're coming from China or Brazil or wherever, then they'll automatically be blocked before they hit any other evaluations. So that's, again, super severely mitigating any identity-based attacks from that perspective. Very quick win. All right. The next on our list was DLP. So I talked about credit cards and then student IDs. So before we start actually understanding what's happening in our environment and data classification, we need to actually tell it how to identify the data. Now for credit card data, Microsoft already includes this as a template. So we can actually look through this if we want to. You can see there's an ABA routing number. There's ones that are specific to credit card data. And it does checksums against the data so we can see, is there a Visa, is there Amex, and then the way that the numbers or the strings of numbers are actually formatted or the length of them to kind of help give us some insights. We can also create custom ones. So you can see here I've created a custom Contoso EDU student ID. This is my sensitive information type that tells the platform how to identify my student IDs. And so I've done this with a mix of a regular expression. So it's looking for a specific format of both 2 letters, a hyphen, and then a string of numbers. And then I've provided it supporting evidence, meaning I've given it keywords and other evidence to look for within a certain proximity to help give it more confidence in what it's trying to identify. So that might be things like the word student ID or SIDS or SIDS or acronyms or whatever the case might be, again, to just boost its confidence. Just by doing that, we'll start to automatically already get some insights into what's happening within the environment. So we can then see what types of data and where it's located based on our sensitive information types. But where we get really fun is in DLP. So DLP is built upon those information types, so where we can create policies. And so I've created some policies that are specifically looking for those and doing different things based on the action the user's taking. So for example, for student IDs, in SharePoint and OneDrive as an example, which is the focus of today, if they try to share it externally, we're going to block it. We won't allow them to share externally, only internally. Same for credit card data, right? And then you can do much more than that. So we can have different variations, we can have exceptions, we can have business justification overrides. There's quite a bit that you can do here, and I'll show the experience as well. To build upon that, get this over here. We can also go a step further and control the user's experience as far as if they're from an unmanaged device, like I mentioned before. And I'm going to go kind of quick, so I want to make sure I leave time open as well. So in this browser session here, let me zoom in. So this is Sherry. She is an HR representative within Kitosu EDU. She's in her OneDrive for Business account that she's signed into, but notice this kind of bar on the top. It's a little hard to get straight here, but it basically says that she's coming from an unmanaged device, so her experience is going to be different. Meaning what I'm doing is because she's in a browser on a machine that I don't manage myself, she can't download, she can't print. And I've also gone a step above with Microsoft Cloud App Security and actually blocked her ability to cut, copy, and paste the data depending on the type of data. So for example, if we open up these individual documents here, we'll take a look at that. But first, DLP kicks in right away. The little do not enter looking signs means that it's detected that these documents contain sensitive information based on my sensitive information types. So you can see it says it contains information, so some commands are available. What that means is, in the past, education institutions would typically disable external blocking or features like the Everyone link, which makes it a little bit more difficult to truly use OneDrive in a collaborative fashion. And so, for example, this HR public policy, because it doesn't contain any confidential data, if I click on share, I can share with the Anyone link. I can also go to specific people if I choose to. I can hit apply, and I can put in somebody who's external to my organization. So this is at outlook.com. And it tells me, hey, they're outside your org, just keep that in mind. But it still lets me go forward with the process. I can send it, I can copy the link, I can do whatever I need to do. But now if I go to the student in review document, because it contains student IDs, notice that the share link for anyone is grayed out. I cannot select it. Specific people still there, so maybe Sherry thinks she's being clever and she's going to type that same external user here. But now she's going to get an actual policy tip that says you still can't share this to this specific person because they are not within the organization. So even if I click on the copy link button, it doesn't actually do anything. I can't select the send button. So I can't physically share this document unless I take an action such as override it, if that was an option, or change the data that's in the document. So now if we zoom out here real quick, if we take a look at a document here, there's no data in here that's sensitive. It's just gobbledygook. It's actually just a generated Star Trek themed text. I love Star Trek. So if I take this text and I copy it and I go into a notepad, it's going to let me paste, right? No surprise there. But now if I go to my PCI sample document, you can see that it says here, you don't allow me to do certain things because I'm not on a managed device. So if I highlight all my Visa credit cards, so don't go spending all at once and try and copy, the action's automatically blocked. And it tells me exactly why, which we can customize as the administrator. Can't copy it because I'm on an untrusted device. So I can't do anything with it. I can't go to file. I can't save it off the cloud. I can only save it here online. And I can't do anything from a print perspective, including directly from the browser. It'll come up with the same modal that says their print action's been blocked. So that's pretty awesome, right? But now the experience changes for Sherry if she's on a managed device. So let me zoom in again for you all. Back to my VM here. So this is a Windows 10 VM. It's Azure AD joined to her Office 365 tenant. She's in her same OneDrive account that we just saw in the unmanaged browser session. So if she comes in to say students in review, notice DLP still won't let her share it externally because we don't care whether she's on a managed device or not. We don't want that shared externally. But you can see that if I actually highlight all of this information, and I'll use the right-click context here, copy, and we go to Notepad, and we paste it. It lets us paste all the student IDs because we're on a managed and a trusted device, right? So you can see how we can still allow our users to be collaborative and work. So she can be in an unmanaged device and still work in Word Online and collaborate with others within the environment securely, but we are protecting the data from getting onto something that we don't know and we can't necessarily trust. Now we can go a step further as well to help better protect the data. So we're going to actually go back to her OneDrive here, and we're going to create a new document real quick. Sorry, the Zoom tool makes my mouse work really, really weird, so I apologize for kind of jumping around here. So this is starting to get into the information protection. So we're just going to say, hey, look at this cool data I want you to see, but do not lose it. Now she knows, Sherry, as the HR manager, she knows that this document contains maybe social security numbers in it. Obviously it doesn't. And we could use auto labeling with A5 capabilities, but in A3, you have this same functionality minus the auto labeling capability. So Sherry, just being a good employee, she knows that she's going to treat this with high confidentiality, and it's only for employees. So she's going to choose all employees, and you can see here at the bottom, it tags it. You can do other things like watermarking, adding to the header and the footer, such as like tagging it as highly classified or whatever other naming convention you want to use. And then again, the watermark, you can have it say basically whatever you want as well. But the important thing here, what this label does, is it actually encrypts this document. And it encrypts it in a manner to where it follows the document no matter where it goes. So now we've gone ahead and encrypted it, but we can still collaborate and work with others within our environment. So the label encrypts it and only allows Contoso EDU authenticated users to work with the document. So we're going to show that and then show what happens when they download it. So we're going to share this with Arden, who's a teacher, and she's going to go ahead and send this using OneDrive for Business, just as normal, just as expected. And then I'm going to zoom out really quick and grab Arden's session. And it looks like Arden's sessions was closed. All right, I'm going to have to sign in as Arden real quick. So give me a second. I apologize. Looks like Arden was done working today. So while I do this, are there any questions? Oh, good. Arden's already signed in. So never mind. Hold on the questions. So Arden's going to go to his email. Now, I've excluded him from the policies that that keep him from downloading documents on unmanaged devices. I'm allowing him to do that for the purpose of this demo. So he's going to open up that shared document that Sherry just sent him that has that label. Now, even though it's labeled, it's encrypted, we can still co-author, we can still collaborate with each other. So as soon as it finishes its load, you can see that Sherry's in here. You can see that I'm in here. So if we get rid of this guy, in Sherry's environment, she'll start to see Arden show up, and he can still add content here. And then we'll see it reflect on her side in just a minute. But the focus here is this is encrypted, right? So he's working on it. That's great. But now let's see what happens if he actually goes to his OneDrive and downloads this document because he's allowed to on this unmanaged device. So this device is not managed by Contoso EDU. That's the name of the document there. So we're going to go ahead and click on download. And again, I'm allowing this for the purpose of this demo. Now, the important thing to note here, though, is because this is not a Contoso managed device, let's say he downloaded it on a library device and it was allowed for whatever reason, and he left and forgot to delete the document. So I'm somebody else now. I'm not Arden. I'm going to open up this document from the downloads folder on this Windows client. And you'll see here what will happen is it'll ask you to sign in before it even shows you any data. Now, I'm actually going to sign in or try to sign in with my Microsoft account, my work account here, if I can spell. And it's going to check and say, nope, this account's not authenticated. You are not allowed to read this document. Now, if I signed in as Arden or Sherry or anybody else that's an authenticated user for Contoso EDU, they would be allowed to open up this document and do whatever they need to do with it. But you can see how if this document was left on a flash drive that wasn't encrypted in of itself and Arden lost his flash drive, these documents are now protected because they'll require that authentication if you configure it that way. Before the document even opens up. So now we've protected the document, even though it's physically left the confines of Office 365. So we're all good there. The next piece here is doing similar protections for, I did still have Arden open. There we go. Is for third-party services like Google. So we are signed in to Office 365 already. And because we've integrated Google Workspace with Azure Active Directory, it actually shows up as an application for Sherry. Sherry uses it for Google Drive for X, Y, and Z reasons. It's sanctioned, it's allowed by the institution, so we're all good there. But notice how it's automatically logging us into our Google Workspace for us. It's not prompting us for any credentials. It's going to use our token from Azure AD since we're already signed in to Office 365, assuming the demo gods still like me and it didn't refresh our token yet. So as soon as we see this come through, there we go. Now, because I'm on an unmanaged device, again, I'm using Microsoft Cloud App Security to better protect the data and wrap her experience. So I'm still going to let her get to Google Drive because it's something that we allow, and we want her to be collaborative on the go, but we're going to change her experience slightly. But so far, she says everything looks the same. So we're going to go into her Google Drive, and the first thing she's going to do is she's got that same student's review doc. She's going to right-click on it, and she's going to come on down to download. And what's going to happen is MCAS, the acronym for MCAS, will block it. Now, what happens is it still downloads a file. It downloads a text file, but the text file is simply just basically a timestamp and the description that's listed here in the UI for the user to understand what happened, but the actual file itself was not downloaded. And we can do the same thing from a cut, copy, and paste. So if I implemented that capability here, which I have not for this demo, I could open up this document in Google Drive and highlight all the student IDs and try and copy it. And just like in OneDrive where we saw the block action, we would block that same action here in Google Drive as well. So that is a quick demo of a little bit of how you can go and quickly protect your data, your identities, using conditional access, using things like DLP and information protection, as well as some enhanced capabilities within A5 where you can start to wrap experiences even for third-party solutions that are not obviously coming from Microsoft directly. So I'll pause there and see if there's any questions.
We do have a question from Devin. So he wants to know, how does Microsoft handle new countries when it comes to the blocked country list? And do you have it to go, or do you have to go in and add them to a list?
Great question. So today, conditional access in the block countries idea wasn't actually like a feature. It was something that actually education spurred as a use case. So does Microsoft track a bad country list? So yes, we have a reputation list that we use for our threat analytics and the rest of our stack, including for detections like impossible travel, compromised user, and so forth. The list kind of goes on. But to do a hard block, the list that you saw me show within Azure Active Directory, that is something that you have to manually keep up for the time being. There may be a time in the future where that might be an actual feature where Microsoft keeps that up for you. But for the time being, if there's a new country that spurs up, you'd have to make sure you go in that list and add that as soon as Microsoft updates as well. Now, there's APIs that you can use to monitor for that if something changes or if there's a new addition so that you get an alert to go and update that. But that's something that you do physically have to manage for that specific use case.
Perfect, thank you. That's the one question that we have right now in the chat. So if anyone else has any questions, definitely post in the chat, or if you want, you can get on the mic and just raise your hand and we can just kind of go through questions that way.
Yeah, so I'll just quickly finish that there's only 2 more slides here, and then I'll hang around until the 11:15 mark. So I'm glad I was able to keep on time. Awesome. So we touched on a lot, right? We touched on the general landscape for EDU when it comes to what we're seeing from a common attack perspective. Obviously, a lot of it coming and stemming from email-based compromise, ransomware, and so forth, to some of those common misbeliefs or pitfalls, right? Again, sometimes we have reasons, and that's totally fine, but it's just understanding and justifying and accepting that risk that's potentially there. Touched a little on A3 versus A5. There's still a lot to unpack there, both from a licensing perspective as well as a feature and functionality perspective. And then we gave you some quick wins as well as some homework, right, in those best practices and strategy that you definitely want to make sure you go through that stemmed from our human operated mitigation plan. So there are additional resources that I've included in this deck. I've tried to keep it in order of things I find of most value for kind of getting started and trying to get your hands wrapped around a lot of these products and features, but some of these might be a little too high level if you're already in the A5 world and you're already starting to implement these. But do leverage these. Sometimes you'll find some things that are of good use that you didn't quite think about before. For example, I know there was a question earlier about the Defender for Office 365. This link here is specifically around a configuration analyzer tool that will actually analyze your environment specific to MDO, and it will provide you steps on how to better protect your users from email-based attacks based on what Microsoft says it should be configured within your environment and so forth, and gives you reasons. So lots of good stuff here that I highly recommend you take a look at. And then that's the end of the PowerPoint there.
Perfect. We just had a question come in. The question is, when you put a conditional access policy in report mode, how do you view the report?
Oh, that's a really good question. So there's the free way, and then there's the paid way. So, and I hate to say that, but I like to be transparent. So let's talk about the free way, because the free way sometimes is the way you want to go. So within Azure Active Directory, if we go back to the main Azure AD Admin Center here, and we go to sign-in logs, anytime a user comes in, whether it's an interactive, we can also see non-interactive, service principals, and so forth. This is a really good report to really get familiar with. But what we'll see here is there's a status of success, which is the overall, did they sign in, did it fail, or did it not? Then there's conditional access here. Now, if we click on any one of these sign-ins, you'll see a conditional access tab that will actually show you the results of each individual policy that you have within your environment. Now, if it's in report-only mode, you'll see the results as either success or not applied or failed, because it's giving you the insights as if it was in production, but it doesn't actually impact the user. The user has no idea that they were even evaluated against it. So when you actually click on these, it'll break it down and actually show you step-by-step what were the assignments, did they match, did they not, what were the conditions, and then same for the access controls. This is also being updated shortly to be a little bit more in-depth and detailed as well, but this is a free way to do it. You can also leverage the APIs to pull the same type of data if you don't want to go through each individual user. There's ways to export the data as well. But the Microsoft preferred way, which does require the use of Azure Log Analytics, hence that's where the cost is. Within the conditional access admin center or portal blade, whatever you want to call it, there's the ability to turn on auditing essentially for it, or workbooks or playbooks. And what that does is it automatically connects to those APIs and does an event stream of the data into a log analytics workspace. And then Microsoft actually pre-created basically reporting dashboards for you that also give you a lot of this the same telemetry and data, just in a more report-friendly view that you could export. You can publish it somewhere if you want executives to see it, so on and so forth.
Perfect, thank you. So far, that is the newest question we have in the chat. So like I said, if anyone has any questions, definitely either raise your hand, get on mic, or continue to post in chat. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. I'll mention one other thing about conditional access, since the report only thing. The what if will be your best friend as well. If you haven't leveraged this before, it's our simulation tool, if you will, that doesn't require you to actually have test users and go through the whole process. So essentially what you can do is you create your policies, and maybe you put it in report only mode, or you just don't scope it to anybody just yet, but you still kind of have to. So you want to configure your policies in a way that you would if you're publishing them. But then what you do here is you select a user that would or would not be flagged for it. And then you select the application that you're simulated that they're going to come into. So I might just say, I want to only focus on if they're coming to Office 365. And then you can give it an IP address. So you can use the what is my IP from Google or Bing, and you can put that in here. You can use other IP addresses, and it has to match with a country. So you could grab an IP from Switzerland if you want to, and then put the country of Switzerland to see if you're blocking it. Or for the United States, you would select US and then a US-based IP. And then you can go through and actually configure, like, simulated wise. My user's going to come from Android. They're going to be trying to come in from a browser. Their sign-in risk is low or high. And then you would click on what if, and this will actually pump out a very quick analysis of, here's the user's impact from this conditional access policy in your experience. It'll show you exactly which one would apply to them and why. So a really good, useful tool that not a lot of people kind of pick out, because it's kind of transparently hidden right here in the top.
Perfect. We had another question come in. Do conditional access rules support IPv6 yet?
They do. It's part of our named locations, and there's enhanced support that's being continuously built for IPv6. I would still say it's not as robust as IPv4, just at the moment, mainly because IPv6 is not widely used. Where we saw a lot of issues were around mobile devices, telecom providers like T-Mobile, AT&T. They obviously use IPv6 for a lot of reasons. So there is new support built into conditional access. I don't have the link in the deck, but if you just Bing or Google conditional access IPv6 announcement, there was a blog post done by one of our identity leaders on the corporate side of Microsoft on the product group, who actually talks about a little bit about what the enhancements look like and then kind of the future from there. Good question. All right. Well, it's 11:11, so we've got a few more minutes. I'm happy to hang out. If there's any other questions, please feel free to come off mute. Otherwise, I will have to drop at 11:15 my time. But until then, you got me.
Did we have a survey we wanted to post up?
Yes, that survey is going to be posted in the chat right now. The survey is designed for you guys to request for more trainings. So if you guys can take 2 minutes or less to fill out this survey, that'd be great. And we're looking forward to continuing to schedule additional series similar to like what we have today. So thank you guys so much for your input and your participation. And thank you, Nick. This was fantastic.
Absolutely. My pleasure. And I see Chris Neal posted the link for the MDO Ninja series I was talking about. So thank you, Chris. One quick note on that too, that isn't in the PowerPoint. I can add it before I send it over though, but there's a bunch of Ninja series for all of our products. So there's one for Defender for Endpoint, there's one for Sentinel, there's one for Azure Security Center, there's one for Identity that are really, really great as you're trying to go down the path of learning the products and it's before you would pay for any kind of training material. And the product group did a fantastic job adding videos, adding step-by-step guides, and then they're broken out in meaningful ways. So security analyst versus administrator and so on and so forth. So MDO Ninja is a great starting point, and I'll make sure the rest of them are included in the PowerPoint before I send it over so it's when it's shared to all of you next week. Okay.
And there was, I think someone slipped in a question real quick, Nick. I think I saw one before the survey.
Run into blocks during some of these steps. So yeah, so Fast Track is always a great place to start because they're free and they're Microsoft engineers. They do have a script. I'll be completely honest there. So it's not going to be they'll come in and fix everything or really walk you through deep, complex integrations or deployments, but they can definitely be a good starting point. And a lot of times the resources that they have access to are very, very useful. Beyond Fast Track, if we're talking about deployment and adoption, it's really going to be a Microsoft partner is going to be the best place to work as far as making sure that you're going through the steps of configuration and best practices and so on and so forth. There are some things that Microsoft can do in conjunction with systems integrators, even partners like OETC. So it always just is best to work with whoever your account executive is going to be, whether it's directly from Microsoft or if you have an account executive from somebody like OETC and just kind of reach out to see what might be available. Especially on the security front, and especially if you're looking to move to A5, always ask what Microsoft can do to help. I'll just say that. Okay, well with that, oh, you still get a permission error. All right, well, I'm sure Melanie will take that. But thank you, everybody. I really appreciate your time. I know we touched on a lot. Security and compliance is very complex. It covers a lot. It spans a lot. So there's still much more to go through. I hope this is a good starting point for you. Thank you again for your time, and have a great rest of the day. Bye, everybody.